Hello, welcome to FinTrail's FinCrime Spotlight, a mini digest which covers current and topical issues related to financial crime. I'm Ciara and I'm joined today by Maya and Greg. For last week, we saw the release of Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, otherwise known as the CPI. So there's lots to unpack in the report, notably the UK slumping to its lowest ever position. So Greg, do you want to start maybe by sort of covering what some have said is pretty damning reading in the report, maybe share some of the highlights and your thoughts on it?
Sure. Hi everyone. Ciara, always pleasure to be here. It's not a happy reading. What we're seeing across the board, as Transparency International even mentioned, we've seen the press release about how corruption levels remain at a standstill, and that's not something just recent, but I think it's go back to like 10 or 11 years, and that's. I think it is quite concerning, right? This is not necessarily a glitch where, we do see from time to time that kind of really researches that things might go up or down. And for sometimes countries can move significantly there. But I think look at this from a global perspective. If you're looking at this and we're saying there's a downward trend, and that's not the trend of the last 2 or 3 years, but we're talking about, last 10 years or so. It is quite depressing. If you look at some of the statistics there, I've got some of those from my eyes. About 95% of countries have made little to no progress since 2017, and more. Looking at our UK perspective, what is even more damning, that probably UK's position is probably one of the lowest we've seen. We don't necessarily want to go into sort of political topics of why that is, but I think overall we're all reading papers, we're following news and seeing what's happening, and hoping that some of that, at least political element, will start turning back, but it's yet to see.
Yeah, I think we're sort of certainly seeing the airtime that it's getting and the focus it's receiving from the wider public, which is positive, but it's how that translates into action. And I think we'll probably talk about the UK's element of it a bit later, but Maya, I'll come to you next. Like, you've raised before that the CPI itself only really looks at one element of corruption, and Transparency International, even by their own admission, have said at its limitations, it only looks at public sector corruption, and it used perceived experts to assess this level of corruption. Like, why is this an issue, and what are your views on the CPI's use as use in country risk assessment specifically, and what other sources should firms be considering when reviewing country risk?
Yeah, thanks, Ciara. It's a really good point on the measurement of public sector corruption, because by looking at the public sector part specifically, it essentially only looks at where bribes are paid, so not who pays them, or who facilitates it and is complicit, or who benefits from it, or where the money goes, or what it's used for. So the key example, so if you have a Western multinational company bribing a government official to win a contract, so say you have a UK construction company bribing a government official in Iraq, that only reflects on Iraq score, not the UK score, because the public sector part of it is in Iraq. So the fact a UK company has paid a bribe doesn't factor into the methodology, essentially. So the people paying the bribes are not really captured in the right way. And the other big criticism, of course, is that big financial centers that handle all the proceeds of corruption and kleptocracy, so whether London or New York or Switzerland, they all score really well on the index, because again, that's not where the bribe is paid. That's not the public sector portion of it. It's where the bribe money ends up. And that's not just a coincidence and something that happens irregardless of what these financial centers set out to do. The same is also true of tax havens and secrecy jurisdictions that enable this by having a veil of corporate opacity that deliberately hide who owns companies, and having legal structures that enable this. So it's quite deliberate. And they benefit from this. They make money from this, from the proceeds of corruption and kleptocracy, and none of that is captured in the index. So for financial institutions, they need to think about what business they're doing and who with, and then really think through how the index helps them understand that risk. So if you're financing a government infrastructure program, for instance, then yes, look at the country score on the index. If you're dealing with the government of a country, understanding if there is a high level of corruption is useful. although actually even then there are nuances. It's not always hugely reliable. It can vary by sector. It can be quite outdated because it's based on perceptions, and it can take time for reforms to change how people think about and assess a country, etc. But it is at least broadly useful in that sense. But if you're banking, say, Western companies, the fact that they're UK companies or Danish companies or French or whatever countries that score well on the index doesn't mean there isn't a corruption risk. So you need to look more broadly, not just at where they're incorporated, but where they're doing business and the sectors as well as the country risk to understand better what the corruption risks are that they pose.
So what you're saying, Maya, is actually much worse than
yeah, exactly. This is only like, this is bad. It indicates rising levels of corruption, and it's only one part of it. Yeah,
it is. And I think like I read an interesting article about the differences between those at the top of the list and those in the bottom, and the correlation of how like advanced economies and the privatization of infrastructure, like infrastructure, education, healthcare, drives sort of a more perceived clean list at the top. As you say, you've got sort of Western, sort of more advanced economies that are more private. It's a private sector you need to be worrying about. And like the chair of Transparency International, Delia Ferreira, stated, I think last week at Davos, that corruption is a global issue, and countries in the West cannot be enabling corruption elsewhere. And like, what are your thoughts sort of on this, and like what comes from, what do we need to be looking at for it?
Yeah, I completely agree. The outcome of the methodology and what it chooses to focus on is that there is a direct correlation in essence between richer developed Western countries that score well and developing countries in the global South that score poorly. So by choosing to focus on certain parts of it, the methodology essentially does create this biased output. And so it is very problematic from that perspective. And the other major problem with that is that it focuses on specifically the public sector officials involved in bribery, but the way it's used as well as it presents the countries at the bottom of the list as the bad guys, as the corrupt parties, as the villains, when actually the people in those countries are the victims. They're the ones who absolutely lose out the worst from kleptocracy and corruption. They're the ones whose money is being stolen. And yet it's a very blanket tool. It's like Iraq is bad, Somalia is bad, Angola, other countries that score badly, they're bad. It's like certain government officials are bad, but the people of these countries are the victims. And that is not what the index is reflecting, but that kind of gets lost in the narrative when you talk about it. And yeah, so I do think that's a problem. Transparency International are aware of this completely, and they highlight in the other work that they do and the other advocacy that Western countries are complicit, essentially, and that the CPI doesn't indicate all areas of corruption and that it is measuring one specific thing. But that's a nuance that's often lost in practice, and that's harder for firms to implement because it's narrative, it's a discussion of this issue, whereas the index is a nice list of numbers that they can just take and plug into a country risk assessment process, for instance. So it's used as a blunt tool, and all of that nuance is lost.
Yeah, and I think to be mindful as well.
If I may just come to my mind what you just said, Maya, how that then translates into the type of enhanced due diligence that might be performed on the payments to those countries where, is the common man, as you say, the people, remitting money back and so on, need to go through such a hoops to move that $50 back to the country. Why is the large flows of illicit funds don't seem to have that problems, right, across the borders?
Yes, which is one thing you can take away in terms of actually implementing this. Like if you're using this as a bribery and corruption indicator, as you say, Greg, like smaller payments, that's not what this is measuring. Like there is no way that this should relate to those smaller payments. So if you're imposing stricter conditions, more enhanced due diligence, more monitoring of really small value remittance amounts based basically off a country's score in the CPI, that doesn't make any sense. And it just seems so unfair. Like, first of all, your country is looted and the money is stolen, and you have to live in a country with substandard infrastructure and healthcare, etc., because your money has been stolen and looted and taken overseas. And then you get inferior access to financial services because you are deemed a risk.
think they're very valid considerations, and I think that move, as you talk about, of funds flows then into more developed countries, and I think the UK is probably a great example of that, where we're seeing such an influx of funds from other nations, and the report itself specifically highlights the UK. It's in its biggest slump since reporting. I think only 5 countries saw year-on-year scores drop by more than 5 points, and that was the UK, along with Qatar, Myanmar, Azerbaijan, and Oman. Which then I think when you coincide with Transparency International UK, they released their research yesterday through the Keyhole, which looks at the analysis of the register of overseas entities and shows that over half of the companies required to declare ownership have failed to do so. And like when you think of companies house reform, which has been a lot in focus, and some of the key findings and the issues in that report, I don't know, Greg, do you maybe want to touch on that and the importance of some of how it relates to this conversation as well?
Sure. I think it's a great example of just showing how painful the process is to making some of those changes. I mean, let's remember, it was a good few years discussions about, bringing that in. Then back in March 22, finally the law was introduced. The deadline was given, just to refresh, and for those who might not be familiar, that under this new law, any foreign business holding land assets in the UK might register Companies House as an overseas entity and disclose who controls them. As we see in that report, that's not necessarily, post the deadline. What we're seeing is there's a huge percentage of those entities which still has not declared ownership at all, or failed or reported misleading information, or information which doesn't make sense, information claiming that there's no UBO, or is that naming the trust providers as UBOs, and so on and so on. So, some small steps are being taken, but it's still going to take years. And let's not forget, this money move constantly, and by the time maybe UK managed to 45 in here, there's going to be another loophole where all that money is going to move. So it's always whack-a-mole, isn't it? But looking from practical perspective, that report, what maybe firms might find interesting, there's a couple of case studies showing how those structures might be used to obscure some of that ownership. So maybe especially for the firms exposed to that type of market, or providing services and products within this market, that might be something they want to be aware of. If they're not already, they should be already, right?
It was an interesting report, just following on from that, though, because the tone of it was, obviously it's highlighting all of these failures, etc., but it does also say, I think, quotation, that the UK is at the forefront of efforts to improve corporate transparency, which is true in a sense. Like, for all its faults and the fact that the information is not validated, like Companies House in theory does provide a lot of details and is very, very publicly accessible, etc., compared to registers in other countries. So the tone of the report wasn't that damning overall. It was more like, there are things we need to iron out. This still hasn't been embedded properly. But it was like, but there is scope to do that. Like, we need to see how this is implemented and keep up the focus and provide practical recommendations for how to make this better. So it wasn't just a blanket, this doesn't work, this is, this is a waste of time. It was sort of applauding the effort, which was interesting.
No, it's a fair call, because there are some jurisdictions out there where have not even considered bringing something like this to life, right? So fair. Put a few points for the effort, but because if we execution could be better, right?
Yes, always, because if we want a depressing liturgy of sort of bad corporate transparency moves, the UK is actually still doing pretty well. If you look at other global developments, so in Europe last year, for instance, you had a ruling by the European Court of Justice that said that corporate transparency infringes on the right to privacy. So essentially, members of the public shouldn't know that I own shares in a company. That's violating my right to privacy. That shouldn't be public information. And that's obviously a really serious blow to corporate transparency. And we don't know yet how it will play out long term, but we've already seen some countries either not moving ahead with plans to increase the transparency of their registries, which previously they were supposed to be doing under EU regulations, or they're already starting to restrict them, so they're not publicly accessible. And meanwhile, in the US as well, we had the final rule for the beneficial ownership information reporting system was announced in September last year, which looked like it was indicating the US would actually have sort of a countrywide UBO transparency. There would be a UBO registry. But now, a few weeks ago, we've seen the draft form for that, and it's nothing like that. Companies can basically declare, I don't know, we don't know, for a huge bunch of fields, like including who owns the company. So it's not a UBO registry. It really doesn't change very much. So against that backdrop, the UK starts to look like it is sort of setting the standards in terms of what should be available. And then, as we said, it's that question of enforcement and validation and making sure the information is actually fit for purpose.
Yeah, I think that'd be a great test now to see what kind of enforcement you see on the back of that.
Yeah.
And how quickly,
Exactly.
how swiftly be applied.
Yeah, I think that sort of companies how showing their teeth and the powers that they can wield off the back of it and actually doing something with it will make hopefully drive some traction on it. So Greg, in the interest of time, maybe do you want to wrap up and sort of thinking in light of this broader conversation we've had today, what are the practical takeaways firms should be thinking about off the back of the CPI and Transparency International's recent reports?
Sure. I mean, there are definitely a couple of things Maya already alluded to in terms of practicality, but definitely, again, I mean, risk assessment comes back on the forefront, and very often bribery corruption is a little bit of kind of second thoughts when you're doing your risk assessment. I appreciate that, very often it materializes as a money laundering, so you might not even know how that money was initially generated. But at the same time, I think there's this scope to really think through to what extent your firm's products and services might be abused for that reasons, the sectors you're interacting with, the type of customers you're interacting with, would it be any specifically sustainable for that or not? And obviously, when you're starting with this, then when you start with bribery or corruption, let's not forget about PEPs. But at the same time, it's not only PEPs, right? It's also, as Maya mentioned, is also those who paying those bribes. Is any of the industry you're interacting with, there is a known history of that kind of behavior, and there's quite a few industries who definitely comes to your mind, right? Which do have that industry, including whether that's defense sector and some others. There is still a question of controls around source of funds and source of wealth, because at the end of the day, if you better understand the customers and where that money is coming from, that should give you a better control or better place to identify some of those flows which might potentially be linked to some of that bribery or corruption. I don't know, Maya, missed anything else?
No, I think that's fairly comprehensive. And obviously all of these parts interlock and fit together, and it's the danger of something like the CPI is it looks like something that is very tangible and very simple to implement and is more concrete than sort of more abstract ways of factoring risk in other ways. But yeah, as we've discussed, there are the limitations for doing that, and as you say, that and affects all those different parts of the compliance program.
Great, brilliant. Well, thank you both for your time today. I think it was really interesting and insightful conversation. And thanks to everyone watching our FinCrime Spotlight. Bye.